My father threw my vintage suitcase out into the freezing Chicago rain, looked me dead in the eye, and told me to go live in the streets. He did not know that his precious suburban mansion was already slipping into foreclosure, and he certainly did not know that the daughter he was kicking out was a multimillionaire who was about to buy his debt in cash. My name is Clara. I am 33 years old, and this is the story of how losing my childhood bedroom became the most brutal and satisfying acquisition of my life. Before I dive into the details, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who completely underestimated your worth. Growing up in Winnetka, one of the wealthiest suburbs of Chicago, appearances were the absolute only currency that mattered to my parents, Richard and Patricia. Our sprawling brick colonial home with its perfectly manicured lawn and oversized bay windows was a fortress of impossible expectations and suffocating judgments. Last Friday evening, the skies over Illinois opened up into a freezing, relentless downpour. I had driven through the brutal rush-hour traffic specifically for my father's 60th birthday dinner. I arrived early, seeking a few moments of quiet peace before the inevitable family performance began. I carried my overnight bag upstairs to my old bedroom, the very room I had paid $15,000 to renovate for them just last winter when the roof started heavily leaking. I set my vintage leather suitcase on the bed, grabbed a quick shower to wash off the travel fatigue, and changed into clean clothes. But the exact moment I opened the bathroom door, a blast of cold, damp wind hit my face. I walked out to the landing and looked down the grand, sweeping staircase. The heavy mahogany front doors were wide open to the violent storm. I quickly stepped out onto the porch, the freezing rain immediately stinging my skin. There, lying upside down in a massive puddle on the stone steps, was my vintage suitcase. It had been violently thrown out, the brass clasps popped open, my carefully folded clothes soaking up the muddy, freezing rainwater. A loud, booming laugh echoed from the foyer right behind me. I turned around to see my younger sister Brittany striding into the house like she had just conquered a small nation. At 29, Brittany was the undisputed golden child of our family. She had always been everything my parents intensely valued: loud, demanding, and constantly wrapped in expensive designer labels funded by someone else's credit card. Right behind her was her husband Jamal. Jamal was a 31-year-old African-American man who dressed like he was constantly posing for a high-end business magazine cover. He wore pristine white luxury sneakers, a tailored blazer, and a heavy gold watch that caught the chandelier light. Jamal loved to introduce himself, to anyone who would listen, as the visionary founder and CEO of a revolutionary tech startup. In reality, it was a ghost company that never seemed to produce an actual product, but somehow required endless rounds of seed funding straight from my father's bank accounts. Movers in gray uniforms were hauling dozens of heavy designer boxes and sleek modern furniture pieces right past my shivering body. They tracked thick mud all over the expensive Persian rugs my mother prized so highly, but nobody seemed to care in the slightest. Brittany stood dead in the center of the foyer, pointing a perfectly manicured finger toward the second floor, specifically pointing straight at my bedroom door. I stood dripping wet on the threshold, staring at the absolute chaos unfolding in front of me. Jamal was loudly shouting instructions over the deafening noise of the storm, arrogantly boasting to the movers about exactly how much his new studio equipment cost. He paced back and forth, gesturing wildly with his hands, making absolutely sure everyone within a 1-mile radius knew he was an important entrepreneur making massive business moves. I stepped back inside the house, shivering violently, freezing water pooling at my feet on the hardwood floor. My mother Patricia suddenly emerged from the formal dining room holding a crystal wine glass. She did not ask why I was soaking wet. She did not ask why my personal belongings were currently drowning in the storm outside. Instead, she took one single look at my simple, unbranded sweater and sighed with that deeply familiar, soul-crushing disappointment she reserved strictly for me. She walked right past me to warmly embrace Jamal, pulling a platinum credit card out of her pocket and handing it to him right in front of my face. She told him to go ahead and order some late-night sushi from that outrageously expensive place downtown, insisting with a sickly sweet smile that a brilliant founder like him desperately needed premium brain food for his upcoming investor pitches. The contrast was sharp and deeply suffocating. My mother was enthusiastically financing premium sushi for a man who had never held a steady job in his adult life, while her own daughter, the one who actually ran a highly lucrative cybersecurity firm, stood freezing and completely humiliated by the front door. Because I purposefully chose to live quietly, investing my money in heavily guarded corporate entities, rather than flashing it in their faces, they simply assumed I was struggling to survive. They assumed my understated practical clothes meant I was poor. They assumed my constant silence was a sign of total weakness. I watched Jamal kiss my mother's cheek and confidently pocket the platinum card, turning his gaze toward me with a smug, highly self-satisfied smirk. Brittany walked over and crossed her arms tightly, her massive diamond engagement ring catching the ambient light. She looked me up and down from head to toe, her expression a perfect, flawless mirror of my mother's lifelong disdain. She opened her mouth fully, ready to deliver the kind of toxic, entitled justification I had been forcefully subjected to my entire life. Brittany crossed her arms, flashing a massive diamond ring that likely maxed out our father's credit limit, and delivered her news with a sickeningly sweet smile. She proudly announced she was 2 months pregnant. She patted her perfectly flat stomach and declared that her growing family urgently needed my room. My mother immediately stepped up beside her, placing a fiercely protective hand on Brittany's shoulder. Patricia coldly informed me that the pregnancy changed absolutely everything in the house. Because they were expecting a new baby, Jamal desperately required a dedicated studio space for his high-level startup pitches. They had decided my childhood bedroom was the absolute perfect location for his non-existent business meetings. I stood frozen, freezing water dripping from my hair onto the expensive foyer rug, staring at the sheer audacity of the two women in front of me. I calmly reminded my mother that I had just paid $15,000 entirely out of my own pocket to completely renovate that exact room last winter. I had replaced the rotting floorboards, fixed the heavily leaking roof above it, and upgraded all the old electrical wiring because my parents claimed they could not afford the critical repairs on their fixed income. I had handed over my hard-earned money under the strict, explicit promise that the room would always remain my private sanctuary whenever I came to visit. Patricia rolled her eyes, utterly and completely unbothered by the financial reality of what she had just done. She scoffed and told me not to be so incredibly petty over money when her precious golden child was bringing a new life into the world. She insisted that since I was a single woman with absolutely zero prospects of ever starting a family, I simply did not need the space anymore. She looked at my soaked sweater with pure disgust and suggested I could just sleep on the old pull-out couch in the damp basement if I really insisted on staying for the weekend. The sheer level of delusion was staggering. The basement she casually offered was prone to severe flooding and had no functional heating system. Meanwhile, up on the second floor, movers were currently violently shoving Jamal's luxury gaming chairs and expensive ring lights into the pristine room I had funded with my own blood, sweat, and tears. Jamal stood near the staircase, loudly demanding the movers be careful with his imported leather background panels. He kept throwing around empty tech buzzwords aggressively, talking about server architecture and seed capital words I knew for a fact he did not even slightly understand. As a leading cybersecurity expert who literally built server networks for massive corporations, listening to Jamal pretend to be a tech founder was physically painful. He did not know how to code. He did not know how to build software. His entire supposed business model was just an incredibly flimsy excuse to avoid getting a real job while leeching completely off my parents. Yet my parents worshipped the ground he walked on, simply because he knew how to dress expensively and talk a good game at their high society dinner parties. They desperately wanted to project the image of a wealthy, successful family, and Jamal played the part of the rich tech visionary perfectly, even though his lifestyle was entirely funded by my father's rapidly depleting bank accounts. I looked back out the open front door. The storm was raging harder now. The wind violently whipped my vintage suitcase around the stone porch, tossing my soaked garments into the muddy grass. I watched a dress I had carefully packed get trampled by a mover carrying a giant flat-screen television for Jamal's new fake office. I watched another mover aggressively shove a heavy wooden desk against the hallway wall, deeply scraping the custom paint my mother cared so much about. Even then, Patricia did not utter a single word of protest, completely blinded by the illusion she was desperate to maintain. My internal monologue roared, highlighting the agonizing lifelong disparity in this family. When Brittany wanted to study abroad in Paris during college, my parents took out a second mortgage to fund her luxury apartment near the Eiffel Tower. When Jamal decided he wanted to be a music producer 2 years ago, my father bought him $20,000 worth of audio equipment that currently sat gathering dust in the garage. But when I asked for a simple cosigner for my first tiny apartment at age 20, my father bluntly refused, claiming he needed to teach me strict financial independence. They forced me to work 80-hour weeks building my company from absolute scratch, in a windowless studio apartment surviving on cheap food and sheer willpower, while they financed a life of absolute luxury for the golden child and her con artist husband. And now, after I had silently bailed them out by paying $15,000 to fix their crumbling roof, they were literally tossing my belongings into the freezing rain to accommodate the very parasite draining them dry. My mother did not even have the basic human decency to warn me before I drove 2 hours through a violent winter storm. They just waited for me to arrive so they could physically throw me out and establish dominance. Patricia turned her attention back to Jamal, her voice shifting instantly from the cold, harsh tone she used with me to a warm, sickeningly sweet cadence. She asked him if he wanted anything specific from the sushi restaurant, reminding him to use the platinum card to get the premium sashimi platter. She actively catered to a man actively ruining her financial future, while her biological daughter stood shivering, watching her last safe space in that house be aggressively dismantled. Every single dollar I had quietly given them over the years had been utterly wasted. I did not scream. I did not throw a tantrum. I did not fall to my knees and beg for their love or understanding. The scared, desperate girl who used to crave their validation had died a long time ago, buried under years of relentless emotional neglect. In her place stood a woman who controlled a highly secure, multi-million-dollar tech empire. A woman who knew how to remain perfectly, completely silent while gathering catastrophic amounts of actionable intelligence. I looked at my mother. I looked at Brittany, who was now smirking at me, clearly waiting for me to break down and cry so she could play the victim. I looked at Jamal, who was grinning, holding the credit card that was slowly but surely pushing my family into absolute ruin. I took a deep breath, the freezing air filling my lungs, grounding me in the harsh reality of the present. I was ready for what had to come next. Richard marched down the stairs. He saw the open door, the rain blowing into the foyer, and my soaked figure. His face contorted in pure irritation. He demanded to know why I was ruining his expensive floors. An icy calm settled in my chest. I kept my voice level. I reminded him those floors would have rotted last winter if I had not paid $15,000 to fix the hole in the roof. I also reminded him that I paid their property taxes 8 months ago when he claimed the bank made an error with his escrow account. There was no error. He had simply run out of money trying to maintain a lifestyle he could not afford. I told him I had bailed them out under the strict agreement that my room would remain untouched. The exact moment the words left my mouth, the entire atmosphere in the foyer changed instantly. Jamal stopped talking about his startup. Brittany stopped admiring her ring. Patricia froze with the credit card in her hand. I had committed the ultimate sin. I had exposed the financial truth in front of the golden son-in-law. Richard's face turned a violent shade of crimson. His jaw clenched tightly. His fragile ego was deeply threatened, and his immediate defensive response was explosive rage. He took 3 heavy, aggressive steps toward me, his hands balled into tight, white-knuckled fists at his sides. He loomed over me, trying to use his physical size to violently intimidate me, a tactic that meant absolutely nothing to me now. He spat that I had no right to disrespect him in front of his new family. He yelled that paying for minor house repairs did not give me ownership or any say in the matter. He shouted that Jamal was building a massive empire and needed the space for crucial investor meetings immediately. I did not flinch or step back a single inch. I stared at him with cold, unblinking eyes, watching a grown man throw a temper tantrum because his financial incompetence had just been brought directly into the light. My silence only fueled his intense, blinding rage further. He could not stand that I was not cowering or apologizing for existing. Richard leaned in so terribly close I could feel the heat radiating off him. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face and screamed at the top of his lungs, making the walls ring. My name is on the deed. You are just a bitter single woman with no husband and no kids. Take your trash and go live in the streets. The words echoed sharply off the ceilings, wrapping around the silence. In the past, a statement like that would have completely shattered my entire world, sending me spiraling into depression, desperately trying to earn his fake love back. But today, it just sounded completely pathetic. It sounded exactly like the gasp of a man who had lost control of his reality. I did not scream back at him. I did not shed a single tear of sorrow. I did not beg him to remember that I was his own flesh and blood daughter. I simply looked past his red, furious face and took a mental snapshot of the entire room. Jamal had already lost interest in the argument and was actively trying on a pair of limited edition designer sneakers that my parents had undoubtedly paid for with my money. Patricia was wrapping her arms around Brittany, loudly comforting her, because the yelling was supposedly causing her too much stress and could harm the unborn baby. They were a perfect self-contained ecosystem of absolute toxicity and severe financial ruin. I pulled my phone from my pocket. My fingers did not tremble at all. I opened my ride-sharing app and calmly requested an Uber Black to take me safely back to downtown Chicago. The app confirmed a professional driver was 2 minutes away. I looked at Richard one last time. He was still breathing heavily, clearly expecting me to break down, clearly waiting for the emotional reaction that would validate his cruel authority. I gave him absolutely nothing. I turned on my heel, stepping right back out into the freezing storm. I walked down the wet stone steps, passing my ruined vintage suitcase lying in the mud. I did not even bother picking it up. The clothes inside were replaceable. Everything in that house was replaceable. The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut behind me with a loud, definitive thud, violently severing the final thread of obligation I had ever felt toward those people. The winter rain soaked my thin sweater, but I barely felt the cold. A sleek black SUV pulled up its headlights, cutting the downpour. The professional driver opened the door for me with practiced professionalism. I slid into the warm seat, the vehicle wrapping around me like a shield. As the driver pulled away from the curb, I looked out the tinted window at the massive suburban mansion one last time. The lights were blazing brightly from every floor, illuminating the sheer illusion of their wealth. Richard thought his name on the deed gave him absolute power over me. He firmly believed that throwing me out into the rain was the ultimate punishment for a daughter who refused to blindly worship his golden child. He thought I was leaving with nothing. He had absolutely no idea that my silence was not surrender. My silence was a careful and precise calculation. I leaned back against the headrest, pulling out my phone to check my secure email server. The gears were already turning in my mind. Richard had demanded I go live in the streets because his name was on the deed. I decided right then and there that I would happily let him keep his fragile illusion for just a few more weeks, because soon enough that very same property deed would legally belong entirely to me without any question. The black SUV merged onto the highway. The driver did not head toward a cheap motel. Instead, he navigated straight into the beating financial heart of downtown Chicago. We pulled into a highly secure private underground parking garage located beneath a shimmering glass skyscraper. The heavy steel gates rolled shut behind us, completely sealing out the storm and the chaos of the night. A private elevator opened directly in front of the vehicle, accessible only by biometric retinal scan. I stepped out of the Uber, tipped the driver generously through the app, and walked into the elevator. The doors closed softly, and the high-speed cabin launched upward, ascending rapidly toward the very top floor. When the polished metal doors slid open again, I did not step into a tiny, struggling single woman's flat. I walked directly into a massive, ultra-luxury penthouse that spanned the entire top floor of the building. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking, unobstructed 270-degree panoramic view of the glittering Chicago skyline and the dark, churning waters of Lake Michigan. My family firmly believed I was a failure because I did not flaunt designer labels or drive leased luxury cars that I could not afford. They took one look at my unbranded practical clothing and immediately assumed I was completely broke. They could not comprehend the concept of stealth wealth. I did not need to wear heavily logoed sweaters to prove my worth to strangers. Because my name commanded immense power in boardrooms, they could never even dream of entering. I am an elite ethical hacker and the sole founder of a premier cybersecurity firm that protects the digital assets of international banks and massive healthcare networks. I built the company from the ground up, writing complex encryption algorithms in a dark room, until my software became the absolute gold standard for corporate data protection. My firm is currently valued at over $80 million, and I own exactly 100% of the equity. Every single day I handle digital transactions worth more than my father's entire neighborhood combined. Yet because I wore a simple cashmere sweater without a flashy Italian logo and drove a reliable electric sedan instead of an imported sports car, they treated me like a pathetic charity case. They were so intensely blinded by their desperate need to project wealth that they fundamentally failed to recognize actual immense power standing right in their own hallway. I walked past my grand minimalist living room and entered my private home office. This was my true sanctuary. The room was dark, illuminated only by the soft blue glow of 6 massive custom-built monitors curving around a sleek black command desk. High-end servers hummed quietly in a climate-controlled glass enclosure built into the far wall. This was the nerve center of my entire operation. I took off my damp sweater, throwing it casually onto a custom leather sofa, and sat down in my ergonomic chair. The leather was soft and perfectly molded to my back, a stark contrast to the hard, cold reality of the front porch I had just been violently thrown off. I tapped a single key, and the entire workstation roared to life. Streams of encrypted data, global threat maps, and complex financial algorithms instantly filled the screens. I was completely surrounded by information by absolute control. Here in this room, I was untouchable. There was no screaming father demanding submission. There was no highly toxic mother belittling my existence. There was only pure logical data and the immense capital it generated. I leaned back and let the silence of the penthouse wash over me, finally allowing my mind to fully process the sheer absurdity of the evening. I thought about Jamal standing in the foyer wearing pristine limited edition sneakers he absolutely did not buy, bragging about a seed funding round for a tech company that did not exist. I thought about my mother handing over a platinum credit card to feed a grown man who actively refused to work, while cheerfully agreeing to throw her own biological daughter's belongings out into the freezing mud. I thought about Brittany proudly rubbing her stomach, convinced that carrying a child gave her the supreme authority to steal the very room I had paid out of pocket to repair. The level of collective delusion was honestly fascinating from a purely psychological standpoint. They had constructed a massive, fragile house of cards built entirely on high-interest debt and crippling social insecurity. They were so terrified of looking poor to their wealthy country club friends that they were eagerly allowing a smooth-talking con artist to completely drain their retirement funds. They chose the illusion of a successful family dynamic over actual financial stability, sacrificing their own daughter to maintain a completely hollow lie. My father had looked me dead in the eye and told me to go live in the streets simply because he needed to feel superior in front of a man who was actively robbing him blind. He weaponized the deed to his house, thinking it was the ultimate trump card. He believed that owning that specific plot of land made him a king, and made me a helpless peasant. But data never lies, and bank records never care about human ego. The foundation of his arrogant kingdom was entirely rotten, and I was the only person with the exact skill set required to expose the structural damage. I turned my attention to my center monitor, opening a highly secure encrypted connection to my private wealth management portal. I stared at the blinking cursor, my fingers hovering over the mechanical keyboard. My family wanted to play a ruthless game of real estate and financial dominance. They wanted to draw a hard line in the sand based on who legally owned the roof over their heads. I took a deep, steadying breath, perfectly ready to oblige them. The time for silence was officially over. I ran my hands over the cool aluminum of my mechanical keyboard and shifted my focus to the third monitor on my left. While my main screens displayed active security grids for my corporate clients, this specific monitor was strictly dedicated to personal intelligence gathering. Years ago, dealing with my parents' constant emotional manipulation taught me that information was the ultimate armor. I had written a custom automated property monitoring script that silently scraped public county records, financial databases, and real estate registries across the state of Illinois. It was designed to track the assets of key individuals in my life, ensuring I was never caught off guard by sudden legal or financial shifts. Most days, the software ran quietly in the background, logging minor tax assessments or routine utility changes. But tonight, a bright red notification icon was pulsing insistently in the top right corner of the screen. I double-clicked the alert, bringing the encrypted file front and center. The data packet was specifically flagged for my parents' exact address in Winnetka. My pulse remained completely steady as my eyes rapidly scanned the raw data strings. I initially assumed my father had simply taken out another high-interest credit card to fund his lavish country club dinners, or perhaps he had finally been slapped with a municipal fine for his aggressively overgrown landscaping. But the stark reality of the digital report was far more catastrophic. The automated system had intercepted a highly sensitive legal filing registered just hours ago with the Cook County clerk. The status of their pristine, perfectly manicured suburban estate had officially been changed from active ownership to active pre-foreclosure. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my mind instantly analyzing the legal implications of that single devastating word. Pre-foreclosure meant the bank had formally initiated the process of seizing the property. It meant the quiet, invisible grace period was entirely over, and the ruthless machinery of legal eviction had begun to turn. I quickly bypassed the public summary and initiated a deep dive into the secured banking metadata attached to the property deed. The financial rot I uncovered over the next few minutes was absolutely breathtaking in its sheer scale and utter stupidity. My parents had owned that massive house for over 2 decades, and by all logical accounts, they should have paid off the primary mortgage years ago. Instead, the screen revealed a massive gaping wound in their financial history. Exactly 6 months ago, Richard had quietly visited a predatory lending institution. He had legally leveraged the remaining equity in his home to take out a massive second mortgage. The total amount borrowed was a staggering $450,000. I pulled up the digitized transaction ledgers, tracing the rapid movement of those funds. The money had not been used for home improvements, medical emergencies, or secure retirement investments. Within 48 hours of the loan, clearing a direct wire transfer for the exact amount of $450,000 was sent to a newly registered corporate account. The beneficiary of that account was listed as a limited liability company owned entirely by Jamal. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening clarity. Jamal had not secured venture capital. He had not won over angel investors with his brilliant technological insights. His entire highly publicized seed funding round was nothing more than my father secretly draining the last drop of equity from his own home. Richard had literally mortgaged the roof over his head to hand nearly $500,000 in liquid cash to a con artist who spent his days buying limited edition sneakers and demanding expensive late-night sushi. And now the absolute worst part of the financial disaster was staring back at me in bright red digits. The ledgers showed a brutal, unforgiving timeline. Richard had not made a single mortgage payment in exactly 120 days, 4 entire months of complete delinquency. 120 days of hiding from phone calls, ignoring certified letters, and pretending the financial apocalypse was not actively knocking on his heavy mahogany front doors. I sat back in my chair, visualizing the sheer psychological denial required to maintain that level of delusion. For the past 4 months, while his bank accounts ran completely dry and the threat of losing his home loomed over him, my father had changed absolutely nothing about his daily routine. He still drove his luxury sedan to the exclusive country club every single weekend. He still insisted on hosting massive catered dinner parties for his wealthy peers, forcing my mother to smile and pour expensive imported wine as if their lives were perfect. His fragile ego simply could not handle the devastating humiliation of admitting defeat. Admitting he could not afford his lifestyle meant stepping down from his self-appointed throne. It meant confessing to his elite social circle that he was actually broke, and even worse, it meant admitting that his brilliant golden son-in-law was a complete fraud. Rather than face that terrifying reality, Richard chose to double down on the massive lie. He chose to throw his own flesh and blood daughter out into a freezing rainstorm, aggressively confiscating my only safe space in that house, all to maintain the fake, hollow image of Jamal's booming tech startup. He was literally rearranging the expensive deck chairs on the sinking ship while the icy water was rapidly pouring into the lower decks. I opened a secure terminal window and began tracing the specific banking institution that currently held this toxic debt. It was a mid-sized regional bank known for offloading heavily delinquent loans to private debt buyers at incredibly steep discounts. A cold smile slowly formed on my face. My father believed his name on the deed gave him absolute power. But deeds are completely worthless if a hungrier predator suddenly buys your underlying debt. He had stupidly handed me the exact weapon I needed. I turned my attention away from my father's sinking mortgage and opened a fresh encrypted terminal. If Richard handed over $450,000 of home equity, I needed to know exactly where every penny went. I initiated a comprehensive digital sweep of Jamal's supposed tech startup. My parents had spent 2 years boasting to wealthy friends about Jamal's revolutionary artificial intelligence platform. They claimed he was securing massive contracts with global tech giants. It was time to see what that arrogant boasting was built upon. I ran a basic query through the Delaware Division of Corporations, searching for business entities registered under Jamal's legal name. The results populated in a fraction of a second. There was no revolutionary artificial intelligence platform. There was no tech enterprise. There was only a flimsy, limited liability company registered under the generic name Vertex Global Solutions. I pulled up the official incorporation documents. The entire company was a ghost town. Vertex Global Solutions had 0 registered employees, 0 filed patents, and 0 physical office space. The corporate address did not point to a sleek technology park or a bustling downtown skyscraper. My satellite mapping software traced the address to a cheap strip mall post office box behind a discount grocery store on the south side of Chicago. It was a classic shell company completely devoid of actual business operations, hastily set up for the singular purpose of receiving undocumented cash. Jamal was not a CEO. He was a financial parasite wearing a designer blazer, utilizing corporate loopholes to construct a completely hollow illusion of success. Creating a shell company was only the first step of his fraud. I needed to see the actual money trail. I deployed a specialized packet sniffing algorithm designed to track international corporate espionage. I instructed the program to cross-reference the routing numbers associated with Richard's massive second mortgage payout. I wanted to see the precise moment those funds entered Vertex Global Solutions and exactly how they exited. The banking ledgers cracked open across my screens like a book revealing a timeline of pure, unadulterated financial ruin. The data showed that the $450,000 from my father's desperate home equity loan hit Jamal's corporate account on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, the aggressive bleeding had already begun in earnest. If Jamal had been a legitimate entrepreneur, I would expect massive outgoing wire transfers to software development firms or cloud hosting providers. Instead, the transaction history read like the spending diary of a lottery winner, out of touch with reality. Tens of thousands of dollars were wired directly to luxury car dealerships to cover lease payments on high-end imported vehicles. There were massive recurring charges at exclusive downtown nightclubs, high-end jewelers, and luxury vacation rental agencies. Jamal was using the liquid equity of my childhood home to finance his ridiculous lifestyle, swiping the corporate debit card to buy designer sneakers, while claiming the money was locked up in vital seed funding negotiations. The vanity purchases were a small fraction of the stolen funds. The absolute core of Jamal's fraud lay hidden in the international wire transfers. As I scrolled deeper into the corporate ledger, I noticed a very clear, highly repetitive pattern. Every single Friday, exactly $25,000 was quietly siphoned out of the Vertex Global Solutions business account. These funds were not going to local vendors or domestic banks. They were being systematically wired to a highly obscure decentralized cryptocurrency exchange based in a jurisdiction with notoriously lax financial regulations. Jamal was actively liquidating my father's house and converting the cold hard cash into untraceable digital assets. I ran a blockchain analysis tool to trace the digital wallets receiving these massive weekly deposits. The encryption was thick, but my software easily bypassed the superficial security layers. The offshore accounts were entirely controlled by Jamal. He was intentionally laundering the mortgage money, moving it far beyond the legal reach of American banks and local tax authorities. He knew exactly what he was doing. Jamal was fully aware that my father's financial ship was rapidly sinking, and instead of trying to save it, he was aggressively tearing apart the hull to build himself a golden parachute. Once the money was securely locked in those offshore cryptocurrency wallets, my parents would never be able to touch a cent of it ever again. The sheer scale of the betrayal was deeply staggering. He was not just a lazy, entitled son-in-law coasting on my parents' desperate need for social validation. He was an active predator deliberately robbing them blind right under their noses. The sickening irony of it all was how fiercely my parents protected him. They worshipped the ground Jamal walked on. They literally threw me out into a freezing rainstorm, sacrificing my personal sanctuary and my dignity specifically to appease the very man who was destroying their entire lives. They believed they were investing in a brilliant tech visionary who would elevate their social status, completely oblivious to the fact they were funding their own absolute destruction. I sat back in the soft leather chair, the blue light of the monitors casting long shadows across my silent office. The entire situation was no longer just a pathetic suburban tragedy. It was a ticking financial time bomb, and the timer was dangerously close to hitting zero. Richard and Patricia were sitting directly on top of the hidden explosive, cheerfully drinking their expensive wine, completely unaware that the massive blast was inevitable. Jamal's offshore cryptocurrency accounts were growing significantly larger every single week, while the bank holding my father's second mortgage was actively preparing to legally seize the property. The brutal collision between their fake reality and the actual devastating consequences was now completely unavoidable. I did not need to warn them at all. I certainly did not need to save them from their own greed. All I had to do was patiently position myself to completely own the collateral damage. As I sat there digesting the sheer magnitude of Jamal's financial crimes, my cell phone buzzed sharply against the cold glass of my desktop. The sudden vibration broke the heavy silence of my penthouse office. The soft blue light from the monitors cast a cool glow across the room, highlighting the stark contrast between my calm reality and their frantic existence. I pulled my eyes away from the offshore cryptocurrency ledgers and glanced down at the glowing screen. The notification banner displayed a new message in the family group chat. It was a chat I had muted years ago specifically to preserve my mental health, but my mother constantly demanded I keep active just in case of an emergency. Tonight, however, there was no emergency. There was only a breathtaking display of pure malicious audacity. I picked up the phone and opened the messaging application, fully preparing myself for another barrage of toxic guilt trips. Instead, what I saw was a high-resolution photograph uploaded by my sister Brittany. I stared at the image on my small screen, completely mesmerized by the sheer level of destruction they had managed to accomplish in less than 3 hours. The photograph was taken from the doorway of my childhood bedroom. The beautiful pale green walls that I had carefully selected and paid a premium contractor to paint just last winter were completely ruined. I had spent weeks ensuring that room was perfect, replacing old drafty windows and installing premium insulation. Now a massive jagged hole had been violently smashed right through the center of the drywall, exposing the old wooden studs and the updated electrical wiring I had funded. Thick white plaster dust covered the expensive hardwood floorboards I had just installed. They had not just moved my things out of the room. They had taken a sledgehammer to the structural integrity of the house, specifically to expand the floor plan. The caption below the photograph enthusiastically explained their brilliant architectural vision. They were tearing down the wall to build a massive custom walk-in closet. The new closet was not for a nursery. It was not for the baby Brittany was currently carrying. It was entirely designed to house Jamal's massive collection of limited edition luxury sneakers. In the background of the photograph, I could see Jamal standing, amidst the rubble of my sanctuary, holding a perfectly pristine white and gold shoe. He was grinning widely, pointing at the exposed electrical wires as if he were a visionary developer breaking ground on a skyscraper. He had literally destroyed the walls of my father's house to display footwear he had purchased using stolen funds derived from my father's secret second mortgage. The sheer layers of irony and financial devastation captured in that single photograph belonged in a museum. They were aggressively tearing apart a house they no longer legally owned to build a shrine to the very man causing their imminent eviction. Every swing of that sledgehammer was just another direct blow to their completely doomed financial future. Another notification pinged loudly. Brittany had followed up her photograph with a long text message dripping with her trademark sickeningly sweet condescension. She typed that she wanted to personally thank me for moving out so incredibly fast tonight. She claimed seeing the empty space really inspired Jamal to finalize his aggressive expansion plans. Then she delivered the ultimate punchline of her deeply delusional reality. She typed that she knew things were probably very tight for me financially right now, especially since I was totally alone with no husband. She magnanimously offered that if I desperately needed a small personal loan to secure a cheap apartment, I should just swallow my pride and ask Jamal for help. She proudly declared that his technology startup was absolutely dominating the market and was about to formally close $1 million seed funding round by the end of the month. She even added that they might hire me to do basic data entry if I promised to drastically improve my negative attitude. I read her message twice, letting the absolute absurdity of her words wash over me. Brittany firmly believed she was the wealthy, generous sister looking down on her pathetic, impoverished sibling from a massive throne of success. She believed Jamal was a brilliant captain of industry, single-handedly elevating our family name. She had absolutely no idea that the $1 million seed round she was bragging about was nothing more than our father secretly draining the final drops of equity from the crumbling house she was standing inside. She had no idea the expensive sneakers she was building a custom closet for were essentially the physical embodiment of her own tragic future homelessness. She felt completely victorious, having successfully bullied me out into the freezing rain while her entire world was actively plunging into an inescapable financial abyss. She was the arrogant queen of a castle made entirely of sand, and the tide was already rushing in to destroy it completely. My parents and my sister honestly thought they had won the ultimate war. They expected me to fire back an angry, bitter response filled with tears and demands for basic respect. They wanted a long, dramatic argument. I refused to give them even a single ounce of that satisfaction. I did not type out a massive paragraph exposing Jamal's offshore cryptocurrency accounts. I did not mention the rapidly defaulting second mortgage. I simply stared at the photograph of my ruined bedroom one last time, feeling the last emotional ties to that house dissolve into nothing. I tapped the screen and opened the keyboard. I typed two simple casual words. No worries. I hit send. Just two completely indifferent words confirming that I was perfectly fine with their decisions. I locked the screen and set the phone face down. A cold, hard smile slowly spread across my face. Let them build their custom sneaker closet. Let them celebrate their fake success. The trap was fully set. I brought my secure banking terminal back to the main monitor. It was officially time to buy their debt. The sun rose over Lake Michigan, casting a cold, brilliant light across my penthouse office. I had not slept a single wink, but my mind was sharper than ever. I picked up my secure encrypted phone and dialed a private number I reserved exclusively for high-level financial maneuvers. It rang exactly twice before my senior wealth manager answered. His name was David, and he managed the massive diversified portfolio generated by my cybersecurity firm. I did not bother with pleasantries or small talk. I gave him a direct order to immediately liquidate $1 million from my low-yield bond accounts and place the liquid cash into a staging fund. David was a seasoned professional who handled massive corporate acquisitions daily, but even he paused for a brief second at the sudden demand for unallocated cash. I calmly explained that I was preparing to make a highly aggressive, distressed real estate acquisition. I told him I needed the capital ready to move at a moment's notice without any bureaucratic delays. He asked no further questions. He simply confirmed the transfer would be completed within the hour and hung up the phone. The first vital piece of the puzzle was officially in place. My next call was significantly more complex. I opened my encrypted contact directory and dialed my lead corporate real estate attorney. Her name was Evelyn, and she was a ruthless legal shark who specialized in highly contested corporate buyouts and hostile takeovers. I forwarded her the digital file containing the exact details of my father's rapidly defaulting second mortgage. I asked her to aggressively analyze the specific regional bank holding the note. Evelyn reviewed the data in real time, her sharp legal mind instantly dissecting the situation. She laughed quietly over the phone and informed me that my father had chosen an incredibly foolish lending institution. The regional bank he used was currently massively over-leveraged and completely terrified of carrying toxic assets on their books. She explained that Richard's mortgage was officially classified as a non-performing loan. Because he had missed 120 days of payments, the bank considered the debt practically radioactive. They were legally required to maintain heavy cash reserves against the bad loan, which was severely hurting their quarterly profit margins. Evelyn broke down the exact legal mechanics of the situation for me. Regional banks do not want to be in the property management business under any circumstances. They do not want to spend months navigating the messy, expensive legal process of physically evicting a stubborn homeowner. When a massive second mortgage becomes a non-performing loan, their primary goal is simply to cut their massive losses and clear the toxic debt from their financial reports. They actively look for aggressive private investors willing to buy the bad debt in cold hard cash, usually at a massive discount. Evelyn confirmed that the bank was practically begging someone to take Richard's failed mortgage off their hands. I told her I wanted to be that exact someone. I instructed her to contact the bank and initiate a quiet cash buyout of the entire debt portfolio associated with the Winnetka property. I wanted to own every single cent my father owed. However, I knew my father intimately. If Richard even slightly suspected I was the private investor buying his debt, his fragile ego would instantly trigger a massive legal counterattack. He would aggressively tie the property up in endless, frivolous litigation just to prevent me from gaining the upper hand. He would cry to the local courts claiming I was a vindictive daughter engaging in predatory lending practices against my own family. I needed an absolute, impenetrable legal shield. I could not let him or Jamal see me coming until the very last possible second. I ordered Evelyn to completely bury my identity behind multiple layers of aggressive corporate anonymity. I instructed her to establish a brand new blind corporate entity. We needed a name that sounded perfectly sterile and completely detached from my personal life, something a bank would never question. We settled on the name Echo Holdings LLC. It was the perfect corporate ghost. Evelyn immediately filed the expedited legal paperwork in Delaware, a state specifically known for protecting corporate privacy and fiercely shielding the actual identities of business owners. Echo Holdings, LLC, was meticulously structured as a completely blind trust. The designated registered agent was a generic corporate law firm situated in a highly obscure commercial office park. If anyone attempted to look up the public records or trace the actual ownership of the company, they would hit an absolute brick wall of legal jargon and empty corporate shells. My name, my massive cybersecurity firm, and my personal wealth would remain completely invisible to the outside world. On paper, Echo Holdings LLC was just another faceless, aggressive investment group swallowing up toxic suburban debt. In reality, it was a highly targeted financial weapon aimed directly at my parents' heavy mahogany front doors. Once Evelyn confirmed the Delaware incorporation was officially active and legally binding, I moved on to the final crucial step. I opened my highly secure banking terminal and initiated a massive wire transfer. I funneled the liquid cash David had prepared directly into the newly established Echo Holdings LLC corporate bank accounts. I watched the secure progress bar on my monitor as hundreds of thousands of dollars moved silently across the highly encrypted digital banking networks. This was not a friendly loan to a struggling family member. This was not a temporary bailout like the roof repairs or the property taxes I had foolishly paid last year. This was a hostile financial takeover of my own childhood home. The massive sum of money officially cleared the final security checks, landing safely inside the impenetrable digital vault of Echo Holdings. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair, staring at the final confirmation screen glowing brightly in the dark room. The corporate entity was fully funded and legally armed for absolute destruction. My father had confidently screamed that his name was on the deed, demanding I go live in the streets like a worthless beggar. But a property deed is absolutely nothing more than a hollow, worthless piece of paper when a blind corporate entity completely owns the massive underlying debt. Evelyn sent a final encrypted message confirming she was formally approaching the regional bank right now on behalf of Echo Holdings to aggressively purchase the non-performing loan. The bank executives would be absolutely thrilled to quietly sell the toxic asset to a faceless cash buyer without asking any difficult questions. Richard and Jamal were currently busy smashing down my bedroom walls to build a ridiculous luxury closet, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet no longer belonged to them. The ultimate legal strategy was flawlessly executed. The paperwork was filed, the cash was successfully moved, and the final devastating trap was officially set in motion. Less than 24 hours after Echo Holdings LLC was fully funded, Evelyn initiated contact with the chief lending officer at the regional bank. She did not call a low-level customer service representative or bother with standard bureaucratic channels. She went straight to the top of the executive food chain, where the massive financial panic regarding failing real estate portfolios was currently residing. The bank was bleeding crucial capital specifically because of toxic loans, exactly like the one my father held. Evelyn presented a completely straightforward, highly aggressive offer. Echo Holdings was willing to purchase Richard Williams' entire defaulted second mortgage portfolio in a single lump sum cash transaction. The only condition was absolute speed and total corporate discretion. The chief lending officer practically tripped over himself to accept the aggressive terms. He did not care who was behind the blind trust making the offer. He only cared that a massive financial headache was miraculously disappearing from his quarterly risk assessment reports right before a major board meeting. The speed of the corporate financial transaction was a true testament to the sheer undeniable power of liquid cash. In the traditional banking world, foreclosing on a massive suburban estate is a deeply agonizing and wildly expensive process. It takes many months of messy legal filings, public notices, and expensive court battles just to eventually evict a highly stubborn homeowner. The bank executives were absolutely thrilled to bypass that entire legal nightmare. They eagerly drew up the debt assignment paperwork, transferring every single legal right associated with the $450,000 mortgage directly to my faceless company. They agreed to sell the toxic debt at a slight discount, just to finalize the deal before the end of the business week. Within 48 hours, the massive digital wire transfer cleared the Federal Reserve Clearinghouse without a single issue. The funds left my secure accounts and landed squarely in the bank's corporate treasury, officially closing the massive deal. The moment the cash officially settled, Evelyn forwarded me the finalized digital contracts. I opened the encrypted files on my primary office monitor, staring intently at the dense legal jargon. The paperwork was flawlessly executed. The regional banking institution had formally relinquished all claims to the Winnetka property. They had stamped the official transfer documents and legally assigned the original promissory note directly to Echo Holdings, LLC. I took my time reading every single line of that promissory note. It contained standard but highly aggressive acceleration clauses. These specific legal clauses dictated that because the borrower had defaulted on the required monthly payments, the entire principal balance of $450,000 was now due immediately in full. There were no more flexible installment plans available. There was no more negotiating room. The massive debt also included heavy penalty fees and exorbitant default interest rates that were aggressively compounding daily. My company was now officially registered with the county clerk's office as the sole, absolute lien holder of the estate. The heavy mahogany doors, the perfectly manicured lawn, the expensive custom flooring, and the structural framing my family was currently violently destroying to build a sneaker closet, all of it was now legally bound to my corporate entity. My father thought he confidently owned a castle, but he was actually just living inside a massive trap that I now securely held the only key to. The psychological shift of that sudden realization was profoundly intoxicating. I was no longer the discarded daughter freezing in the winter rain on the front porch. Legally speaking, I was now my parents' actual bank. I held the absolute unquestionable right to demand immediate repayment of the entire loan. And because Richard was already entirely 120 days delinquent, I possessed the immediate unmitigated power to initiate the final devastating foreclosure process without a single day of grace period. If I gave the order, Evelyn could legally petition the county sheriff to drag them out of the house by the end of the month. I had successfully weaponized their own massive financial stupidity and turned it into an inescapable legal vice. While I sat in my quiet penthouse office holding the literal deed to their entire future, my family remained completely oblivious to the danger surrounding them. Through my property monitoring software, I could see that Richard had not even bothered to log into his banking portal to check the status of his failing loan. He was entirely too busy playing the role of the wealthy, undisputed patriarch. He was likely sitting in his leather armchair drinking imported scotch and bragging loudly to his wealthy friends about his brilliant son-in-law. Patricia was undoubtedly planning her next expensive country club luncheon, completely unaware that the very ground she walked on had been legally sold right out from under her designer heels. They firmly believed that completely ignoring the massive financial problem would magically make it disappear. They arrogantly thought the bank would just endlessly delay the inevitable eviction because they lived in a prestigious, wealthy zip code. Meanwhile, my digital tracking algorithms showed that Jamal was still actively accelerating his massive financial fraud. Just that morning, he had initiated another massive wire transfer from his fake corporate account straight into his offshore cryptocurrency wallet. He was aggressively draining the final remaining thousands from the loan money my father had so foolishly handed him. He thought he was a brilliant criminal mastermind playing a completely victimless game. He firmly believed he would safely cash out and eventually leave my parents to deal with the messy suburban fallout alone. He had absolutely no idea that the silent private investor who just purchased the exact debt he was currently laundering was the very same woman he had mockingly helped throw out into the winter storm. A lesser person might have immediately pulled the trigger. They might have called the county sheriff that very afternoon and demanded an emergency eviction just to revel in the sudden chaos. But I am an elite cybersecurity architect. I build complex digital systems and I know exactly how to time a catastrophic network failure for maximum psychological impact. Evicting them quietly on a random Tuesday morning would certainly be satisfying, but it would severely lack the profound poetic justice they so deeply deserved. My family obsessively valued public perception above basic human decency. Therefore, their ultimate downfall needed an audience. I picked up my phone and sent Evelyn a short encrypted message instructing her to prepare the final notice of default, but specifically ordering her not to file it with the county just yet. I wanted to let them enjoy their fake reality for just a little bit longer before I systematically demolished their entire foundation. Exactly 3 weeks passed in absolute dead silence. I did not reach out to my parents, and they certainly did not reach out to me. From my high-tech office, I watched the digital monitors track the final desperate gasps of their financial stability. Jamal continued his weekly ritual of siphoning precisely $25,000 into his untraceable offshore cryptocurrency wallets. His fake corporate account was rapidly approaching zero. Meanwhile, the regional bank fully updated their county records, formally recognizing Echo Holdings as the supreme legal owner of the Winnetka property debt. I held the loaded gun, but I patiently kept my finger resting firmly outside the trigger guard. I was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment arrived on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in the form of a heavy cream-colored envelope delivered directly to my massive penthouse via a premium private courier service. The envelope was thick, heavily textured, and sealed with an obnoxious gold wax stamp bearing our family initial. I sliced it open with a sleek metal letter opener and pulled out a physical invitation printed on expensive embossed cardstock. The invitation was a breathtaking monument to their absolute collective delusion. It was an extravagant formal announcement for a highly bizarre combined event scheduled for the upcoming Saturday evening. The top half of the heavy card featured elegant flowing calligraphy, officially inviting the prestigious guest to a luxury baby shower celebrating Brittany's highly anticipated pregnancy. The bottom half of the card abruptly shifted to a sleek modern font announcing the exclusive VIP launch party for Jamal's revolutionary technology startup. They were aggressively combining a deeply personal family milestone with a completely fake corporate investor event, and they were hosting the entire circus right inside the suburban house they no longer legally owned. The sheer arrogance required to throw a lavish party on a property currently sitting deep in the jaws of absolute default was staggering. They were dancing wildly on the upper decks of the sinking ship, while the lower levels were already entirely submerged underwater. I stared at the gold foil lettering listing Jamal as the visionary chief executive officer, completely marveling at how aggressively they were pushing a lie that was guaranteed to explode in their faces within days. Just as I set the ridiculous physical invitation down on my glass desk, my secure email terminal pinged with a priority notification. It was a direct message from my mother, Patricia. I opened the email fully expecting a long, rambling list of strict rules I needed to follow if I wanted to be allowed back into the house for the party. Instead, what I found was a spectacular display of completely unhinged financial desperation, poorly disguised as maternal authority. Patricia did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask if I had found a safe place to sleep after being violently thrown out into the freezing winter storm. Her email immediately launched into a harsh, scolding lecture about my deeply disrespectful attitude during my father's birthday dinner. She claimed my sudden dramatic exit had severely stressed Brittany out and almost ruined the entire evening for their important guests. Then came the ultimate punchline. Patricia forcefully demanded that I immediately pay the massive $10,000 catering bill for the upcoming party. She explicitly framed the payment as a mandatory apology fee required to buy my way back into the family circle. I leaned back in my chair, reading her highly aggressive demand over and over again. The psychological transparency of her email was honestly pathetic. I knew exactly why she was suddenly demanding $10,000 from the daughter she had just viciously discarded. They were completely and utterly broke. Richard's bank accounts were entirely empty. His credit cards were maxed out beyond their absolute limits. The massive $450,000 second mortgage had been completely drained by Jamal and laundered into international digital currency. My parents literally did not have the liquid cash required to pay the luxury catering company they had arrogantly hired to impress their wealthy country club friends. Patricia was using emotional manipulation and toxic guilt to extort money from me simply because I was her absolute last resort. She assumed that my silence over the past 3 weeks meant I was deeply depressed and desperate to earn her fake love back. She firmly believed I would blindly empty my meager savings account just for the fragile privilege of standing quietly in the corner of their extravagant party. She was demanding I finance the very illusion that was actively destroying them from the inside. In the past, an email like that would have completely crushed my spirit. I would have agonized over the harsh words, desperately trying to scrape together the funds just to avoid her intense, icy wrath. But sitting in my penthouse office holding the legal power to instantly render her homeless, her aggressive words felt entirely hollow. They were the frantic, desperate thrashings of an animal caught tightly in a trap it could not even see yet. I did not write a long emotional response defending my actions or demanding basic respect. I did not point out the absolute insanity of asking for $10,000 after throwing my belongings into the freezing mud. I simply clicked the reply button and typed a single short sentence. I told her I would gladly handle the entire catering bill and that I would absolutely see them all on Saturday evening. I hit send and immediately wired the $10,000 directly to the catering company from my secure corporate account. It was a remarkably cheap price to pay for a front row seat to their total destruction. I picked up my secure phone and texted my lawyer, Evelyn, giving her the final green light to officially process the default paperwork with the county sheriff. The massive steel trap was now firmly locked, and I was fully prepared to watch it snap shut. Saturday evening arrived with a bitter chill sweeping off the lake, but the massive Winnetka estate was radiating an obnoxious artificial warmth. I pulled my sleek sedan onto the crowded cobblestone driveway, carefully squeezing between a ridiculous lineup of imported luxury sport utility vehicles and hired black town cars. The custom mahogany front doors were thrown wide open, welcoming a steady, loud stream of the Chicago elite. I stepped out into the freezing air, wearing a simple pair of dark tailored jeans, a plain black cashmere sweater, and flat leather boots. It was a highly deliberate contrast to the sparkling evening gowns and custom tuxedos, flowing confidently up the front stone steps. I walked through the grand entryway and immediately noticed the extravagant floral arrangements and the highly synchronized army of waiters carrying heavy silver trays of vintage champagne. I recognized the premium catering uniforms instantly. It was the exact high-end service I had just blindly wired $10,000 to secure. They were smoothly passing around delicate white truffle tartlets to the wealthy guests. The sheer irony of the situation was so incredibly thick, I could practically taste it. I was walking into a lavish, extravagant celebration of my own financial executioners hosted directly inside a massive property I secretly legally owned, and I was the absolute only person in the room who had actually paid the admission fee. The grand formal living room was absolutely packed shoulder to shoulder with Richard's wealthiest corporate colleagues and his elite country club associates. I stood quietly near the heavy velvet window curtains blending seamlessly into the dark background, while I silently observed the magnificent theatrical performance unfolding perfectly before me. My father was holding court near the massive custom stone fireplace, practically vibrating with arrogant, undisputed pride. He was wearing a ridiculously expensive maroon velvet smoking jacket and loudly pouring highly generous measures of imported 20-year-old single malt scotch from a heavy crystal decanter he could absolutely no longer afford. He laughed obnoxiously loudly at a terrible golf joke made by a retired hedge fund manager aggressively patting the smaller man on the back. Richard looked incredibly smug, projecting the flawless, unquestionable image of a highly successful, wealthy patriarch confidently surveying his massive, undisputed kingdom. He was completely and utterly oblivious to the devastating fact that his private bank accounts were entirely drained, and his prestigious social standing was currently resting on a razor-thin edge of a massive defaulted toxic loan. He truly believed he was standing at the absolute unquestionable pinnacle of wealthy suburban society. He had absolutely no idea that the silent, faceless private investor who legally held his entire fragile financial future in a suffocating, deadly grip was currently standing just 20 feet away. Across the massive, crowded room, the supposed guest of honor was putting on an equally nauseating and highly criminal performance. Jamal stood confidently beneath the imported Austrian crystal chandelier, wearing a sharp custom Italian designer suit that was undoubtedly purchased with my father's stolen home equity. He was tightly surrounded by a captive circle of Richard's oldest and wealthiest friends, mostly elderly retired men who barely understood how to operate their basic smartphones, let alone properly evaluate complex modern technology startups. Jamal was aggressively and smoothly pitching his completely non-existent software company using a rapid-fire barrage of highly technical, empty corporate buzzwords. I listened to him confidently throw around complex terms like decentralized blockchain integration, predictive machine learning algorithms, and disruptive cloud-based financial architecture. It was a beautifully orchestrated, highly illegal scam designed entirely to dazzle rich old men who desperately wanted to feel connected to the lucrative modern digital economy. Jamal grinned charmingly as he confidently handed out sleek metallic embossed business cards, inviting these wealthy gullible fools to personally participate in his highly exclusive $1 million seed funding round. I watched him smoothly collect enthusiastic verbal commitments for massive financial investments, knowing with absolute concrete certainty that his so-called revolutionary software was nothing more than a poorly constructed fake landing page in a hidden, untraceable network of offshore cryptocurrency wallets. I was silently calculating exactly how many severe federal wire fraud charges Jamal was actively accumulating in a single evening when a sharp, manicured hand clamped violently tightly onto my upper arm. I turned quickly and found my mother glaring fiercely at me with a look of pure, unadulterated, cold disgust. Patricia was wearing a heavily structured floor-length emerald green silk gown, absolutely dripping in heavy diamond jewelry she had undoubtedly purchased on a maxed-out credit card just for this specific grand occasion. Without saying a single word, she forcefully yanked me aggressively away from the main social gathering, physically dragging me through the formal dining room and shoving me forcefully through the heavy wooden swinging doors into the massive caterer's kitchen. The highly busy kitchen staff immediately scattered, giving us a very wide, uncomfortable berth as Patricia backed me aggressively against the cold white marble preparation island. The air in the warm room was incredibly thick with the heavy smell of expensive roasted meats and delicate sugary pastries, but my mother's imposing presence completely overpowered it with a suffocating toxic wave of pure hostility. She looked me up and down, her eyes slowly scanning my plain black sweater and simple dark jeans with absolute burning revulsion. She leaned in incredibly close, her face mere inches from mine, as her voice dropped to a harsh, venomous whisper that barely masked her seething, uncontrollable anger. She sharply asked me what exactly I thought I was doing, showing up to an important corporate milestone event, dressed like I was going to a cheap discount grocery store. I calmly and quietly reminded her that I was the absolute sole reason there was any expensive food being served at her lavish party tonight. My perfectly calm, logical response only actively fueled her blind, irrational rage. She pointed a trembling, perfectly manicured finger toward the heavy, swinging kitchen doors, gesturing aggressively toward the noisy main living room. She demanded I look closely at Jamal and pay highly specific attention to how a real winner actually operates in the real world. She practically spit the vicious words directly at my face as she forcefully sneered that he was a brilliant young visionary building a massive financial empire. She leaned in even closer, her cold eyes flashing with cruel, triumphant, absolute malice. "Look at Jamal," Patricia sneered deeply. "That is what success looks like. There is no space in this family for a failure." I simply stared directly into her furious, desperate eyes, refusing to blink or break contact for a single second, entirely secure in the absolute knowledge that her fake kingdom was completely doomed. I did not offer a single word of defense. I did not raise my voice or attempt to explain the intricate, complex mechanics of a legitimate corporate seed funding round, or the harsh reality of Jamal's impending federal indictments. I simply let her highly toxic words hang heavily in the hot, oppressive air of the catering kitchen. I gave my mother one final cold, calculating look before turning on my heel and pushing silently back through the heavy wooden swinging doors. The stifling heat of the busy kitchen instantly gave way to the loud, chaotic roar of the main living room. I navigated smoothly through the dense crowd of expensive tailored suits and glittering designer dresses, making my way directly toward the temporary cocktail bar set up near the grand sweeping staircase. I politely requested a tall glass of sparkling water with a single lime from a frantic bartender whose entire evening salary was actively funded by my silent financial intervention. Holding the cold, sweating glass, I retreated to a quiet, shadowed corner near the massive bay windows, completely removing myself from the active flow of the party. I became a silent, invisible observer at my own family's lavish financial funeral. From my isolated vantage point, the entire extravagant gathering morphed into a grotesque, theatrical display of magnificent fake wealth. It was a perfectly choreographed dance of absolute, desperate delusion. I watched Patricia float aggressively through the crowded room, commanding the attention of the wealthiest country club wives. She loudly bragged about Brittany's custom designer nursery and Jamal's imaginary software empire, waving her newly purchased heavy diamond bracelet under the bright crystal lighting for maximum visibility. Every single smile she flashed and every boastful word she uttered was entirely financed by a massive mountain of toxic defaulted debt she chose to completely ignore. Across the room, Brittany was holding court on a velvet antique sofa, graciously accepting expensive wrapped baby gifts from elderly wealthy relatives. She was completely intoxicated by the center of attention, blissfully unaware that the very roof sheltering her unborn child was legally scheduled for a highly aggressive, hostile corporate takeover. And then there was Jamal. He was still aggressively working the room, expertly separating gullible retired executives from their secure retirement funds with nothing more than a bright, confident smile and a handful of meaningless technical jargon. He was a ruthless parasite feeding openly on the extreme arrogance and blind ignorance of my parents. The sheer massive scale of their collective denial was absolutely fascinating to witness. They had actively constructed an impenetrable fortress of lies to protect their fragile, desperate egos. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water, feeling the cold carbonation wash down my throat as I watched my father detach himself from a tight group of local conservative politicians. Richard was heavily flushed, his face a deep, unhealthy shade of crimson from the massive amounts of premium imported scotch he had been rapidly consuming all evening. He was loudly recounting a highly exaggerated story about his past corporate conquests, laughing aggressively and loudly at his own punchline. As he turned away from the wealthy group, he began walking unsteadily in my general direction. His balance was severely compromised, and he carelessly bumped his shoulder roughly against a heavy white marble column. A significant splash of dark amber liquid violently sloshed over the rim of his heavy-bottomed crystal glass, landing directly onto the pristine hardwood flooring. He paused briefly, staring down at the sticky puddle of expensive alcohol, seeping rapidly into the imported wood grain. He looked up, and his heavily bloodshot eyes suddenly locked directly onto mine. The jovial, fake smile he had been expertly presenting to the wealthy crowd instantly vanished, melting away to reveal the raw, bitter hostility he always reserved exclusively for me. He closed the remaining distance between us, stepping aggressively into my personal space. The heavy, sour smell of cheap cigars and expensive liquor radiated strongly from his velvet smoking jacket. He leaned in incredibly close, his voice dropping to a harsh, guttural whisper, explicitly designed to evade the ears of his important guests. "Don't ruin this for us," he hissed fiercely, gripping his crystal glass so tightly, his thick knuckles turned completely white. "I told you before, and I will absolutely tell you again. If you cannot fit in and support this family, you can go live in the streets." The repetition of that specific cruel phrase was not a random drunken mistake. It was a highly calculated weapon. In the intricate toxic dynamic of our family, his intentional repetition was a deliberate psychological tool designed specifically to emphasize my past pain and force me back into a state of absolute submission. He actively weaponized that terrifying memory of the freezing winter rain and the locked mahogany doors, hoping to completely paralyze me with the overwhelming fear of permanent abandonment. He wanted to drive the cold blade of that specific emotional trauma as deep into my mind as physically possible. He used the sharp repetition to remind me of my exact place in his strict hierarchy. But the psychological weapon completely and utterly misfired. The harsh, heavy words that had utterly shattered my entire world just 3 weeks ago now sounded incredibly weak, hollow, and entirely pathetic. The repetition did not emphasize my pain, it actively emphasized my absolute, undeniable power. I looked down at his expensive imported Italian leather shoes, standing squarely on the damp puddle of spilled scotch. I looked at the beautiful polished hardwood floorboards stretching out beneath his unsteady feet. My father firmly believed he was standing confidently on his own sovereign territory, dictating the harsh, brutal rules of his massive, undisputed kingdom. He believed his cruel, repetitive threats still possessed the ultimate authority to break my spirit. He had absolutely no idea that the official signed property deed to the exact floorboards he was currently aggressively standing on was resting safely and securely inside the highly encrypted, impenetrable digital vault of Echo Holdings LLC. He was actively threatening to throw me out into the cold streets from a house that my blind corporate entity legally owned free and clear. The absolute supreme irony of his final desperate threat was simply too magnificent to ignore. I did not flinch or look away. I did not offer a single tear or a defensive argument. I looked directly into his angry, confused, intoxicated eyes, and a slow, genuinely warm smile spread effortlessly across my face. It was a secret, radiant smile born of absolute total control and infinite patience. My silent, joyous reaction completely unsettled him, breaking his confident, aggressive rhythm. He stared at me in total, confused silence for a long, uncomfortable moment, his alcohol-soaked mind completely failing to process my absolute lack of fear before finally turning away and stumbling back into the loud, chaotic crowd. Let him drink his expensive scotch. Let him threaten me with the cold suburban streets. The regional bank had already cashed my massive corporate check, and the heavy, unstoppable legal machinery of his total, absolute destruction was already aggressively in motion. Through the highly secure, encrypted feed of the exterior and interior smart home security cameras I had personally installed and maintained silent administrative access to years ago, I watched the lavish weekend party fade into a bitter, brutal reality. A massive winter storm had aggressively slammed into the Chicago coastline overnight. By early Monday morning, the temperature had plummeted well below freezing, transforming the manicured wealthy Winnetka suburbs into a desolate, frozen wasteland. The harsh, freezing winds howled violently off Lake Michigan, whipping thick, blinding sheets of white snow across my parents' massive cobblestone driveway. Exactly at 8 o'clock in the morning, a nondescript dark gray sedan pulled slowly up to the icy curb. A licensed county process server stepped heavily out into the freezing slush, wearing a thick brown winter coat and heavy leather gloves. He did not care about the prestigious wealthy neighborhood or the expensive imported luxury vehicles parked tightly in the massive garage. He possessed a single highly specific legal directive authorized directly by the county sheriff. He marched methodically up the icy stone steps, his heavy winter boots crunching loudly in the quiet morning air, and stopped directly in front of the massive custom mahogany double doors. From his thick protective leather satchel, he pulled a bright, glowing neon red legal document. He used heavy-duty industrial tape to secure the notice directly at eye level, ensuring it could not possibly be missed or blown away by the harsh winter wind. He snapped a quick digital photograph for his official county records, turned around, and drove away, leaving the massive financial trap fully sprung. The bright neon red document practically burned against the dark, expensive wood of the front door. It was a formal, official notice of absolute foreclosure and emergency eviction. The heavily bolded legal text clearly and unequivocally stated that the original regional banking institution had legally sold the entirety of the defaulted second mortgage. The legal document officially named the blind corporate entity Echo Holdings LLC as the sole absolute lien holder and undisputed legal owner of the Winnetka estate. The legal language printed on the page was utterly devoid of any sympathy or standard corporate flexibility. It aggressively invoked the exact legal acceleration clauses I had carefully reviewed, demanding immediate and total physical surrender of the massive property. Due to the extreme delinquency of the massive underlying debt, there was absolutely no standard 30-day grace period offered. There were no available options for a desperate last-minute payment plan or a temporary legal injunction. The harsh neon red paper dictated a highly aggressive absolute 72-hour mandatory eviction window. By Thursday morning, the entire family was legally required by the county to completely vacate the premises, entirely removing all personal belongings, or face immediate physical removal and arrest by armed county deputies. Inside the massive house, the atmosphere was still heavily sluggish from the extravagant weekend celebrations. Through the interior hallway camera, I watched Patricia walk slowly down the grand sweeping staircase, wearing a luxurious, heavy silk bathrobe and holding a steaming warm mug of imported organic coffee. She looked completely annoyed that the expensive private snow removal service had not yet arrived to clear the massive circular driveway. She aggressively unbolted the heavy brass locks and pulled open the mahogany front door, intending to angrily demand the daily newspaper from the freezing front porch. The bitter, icy wind immediately blasted into the warm, grand entryway, blowing her perfectly styled hair wildly around her face. Before she could even take a single step outside, the bright, glaring red paper taped directly to the exterior glass caught her immediate attention. She frowned deeply, completely annoyed that someone would dare deface her beautiful custom doors with cheap, bright neon tape. She reached out with a perfectly manicured hand and ripped the heavy document violently off the wood. She quickly closed the door against the freezing wind, shivering slightly, as she casually adjusted her reading glasses and glanced down at the bold black text. It took exactly 3 seconds for her brain to fully process the catastrophic legal terminology printed aggressively on the page. The hot ceramic coffee mug instantly slipped from her trembling fingers, shattering violently against the imported hardwood floorboards and sending dark brown liquid splashing aggressively across the pristine white baseboards. A raw, guttural scream ripped violently from her throat, echoing loudly through the massive, silent house. It was not a scream of typical anger, but a sheer, uncontrollable shriek of pure, primal, absolute terror. Richard practically fell down the grand staircase, his silk pajamas twisted, and his face pale with sudden severe alarm. He rushed frantically into the grand entryway, slipping slightly on the spilled hot coffee, and grabbed his hyperventilating wife aggressively by the shoulders. Patricia could not even form a single coherent sentence. She simply shoved the bright red legal notice forcefully into his chest, sobbing completely uncontrollably. Richard snatched the paper from her shaking hands, his bleary eyes scanning the aggressive, bold paragraphs. All the fake wealthy arrogance he had proudly displayed at the party just 2 nights prior instantly evaporated into thin air, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, hollow, empty old man. Panic instantly ripped through the entire household like a massive, uncontrolled wildfire. Brittany ran awkwardly down the stairs, holding her pregnant stomach, her eyes wide with total panicked confusion, while Jamal hovered nervously on the second-floor landing, completely paralyzed by the sudden violent screaming. Richard completely ignored his crying daughter and furiously grabbed his expensive cell phone from the marble entryway table. His hands were shaking so violently he dropped the device twice before finally dialing the private direct line to his executive contact at the regional bank. He paced aggressively back and forth across the spilled coffee, absolutely convinced that this was just a massive clerical error. He firmly believed his elite social standing and his past wealth would easily resolve the terrifying situation. He fully expected the bank executive to immediately apologize profusely and call off the aggressive process server. Instead, the phone rang exactly once before being forcefully transferred directly to a low-level automated customer service line. Richard furiously pounded the zero key until a cold, indifferent corporate representative finally answered the call. Richard immediately launched into a massive aggressive tirade, demanding to speak directly with the chief lending officer and aggressively threatening massive legal retaliation for the bright red notice. He screamed that he was a highly valued premium customer and demanded they instantly void the legal eviction order. The customer service representative calmly allowed him to scream himself completely hoarse before quietly accessing his specific digital file. The young woman on the phone possessed absolutely zero emotional connection to his wealthy suburban status. She spoke in a perfectly flat, monotone voice, reading directly from Evelyn's carefully crafted legal script. She coldly informed him that the regional bank no longer held any financial or legal interest in his property. She explicitly stated that his massive defaulted debt portfolio had been permanently sold in its entirety to a private investment firm known exclusively as Echo Holdings LLC. When Richard desperately demanded the immediate contact information for this new corporate entity to negotiate a quick temporary financial settlement, the representative delivered the final devastating blow. She flatly explained that Echo Holdings LLC was a completely closed blind corporate trust that strictly communicated only through their dedicated legal counsel. They did not accept inbound phone calls from defaulted borrowers, they did not offer flexible payment plans, and they absolutely refused to negotiate any terms under any circumstances. The representative casually advised him to quickly pack his belongings to avoid federal arrest and promptly disconnected the call, leaving Richard standing helplessly in the freezing entryway, listening to a dead dial tone. The massive 72-hour countdown clock had officially started ticking loudly in his ear, and there was absolutely no way to stop it. The dead dial tone echoed endlessly in the freezing grand entryway. Richard stood perfectly still, staring blankly at his expensive phone as the absolute gravity of the situation finally breached his thick walls of denial. The 72-hour countdown was not a negotiable suggestion. It was a concrete legal mandate enforced by the full weight of the county sheriff. The massive Winnetka estate, the undeniable crown jewel of his entire social identity, was officially slipping through his fingers. He slowly lowered the phone, his knuckles completely white, and turned his desperate, terrified gaze toward the top of the grand, sweeping staircase. Jamal was still standing there frozen on the second-floor landing, wearing a ridiculously expensive silk dressing gown. He looked entirely out of place, like a frightened child playing dress-up in a wealthy man's closet. Richard did not see a beloved son-in-law in that moment. He saw a massive, glowing life raft. Richard aggressively marched past his sobbing wife, completely ignoring Patricia as she knelt helplessly in the spilled coffee. He took the carpeted stairs two at a time, his heavy breathing echoing loudly in the silent house. He cornered Jamal directly against the heavy wooden banister, violently invading his personal space. The sheer desperation in Richard's eyes was incredibly intense. He aggressively gripped Jamal's forearms, his voice trembling with a frantic, volatile energy. He demanded that Jamal immediately transfer the massive seed-round capital they had been celebrating all weekend. Richard forcefully explained that a faceless, predatory investment firm had hijacked the second mortgage and they needed to instantly deploy maximum liquid cash to forcefully buy out the toxic debt before Thursday morning. He was literally begging the young man to save the family kingdom, heavily relying on the absolute certainty of the million-dollar tech valuation they had bragged about to the country club elite just 2 nights ago. For the first time since he had infiltrated the family, Jamal completely lost his slick, arrogant composure. The smooth, confident pitchman who could easily separate elderly men from their retirement funds vanished instantly. His dark eyes darted frantically around the hallway, searching desperately for a non-existent escape route. A thick, heavy layer of cold sweat immediately broke out across his forehead, catching the dull morning light streaming through the massive arched windows. He nervously licked his dry lips, stammering completely incoherently. He tried to physically step back, but Richard had him firmly pinned against the thick mahogany railing. Jamal raised his hands defensively, his voice cracking awkwardly as he frantically attempted to string together another web of complex technical lies. He weakly claimed that the million-dollar seed funding was completely secure, but it was currently heavily locked inside a highly complex international escrow account. He aggressively babbled about strict federal banking regulations, decentralized blockchain verification periods, and mandatory offshore holding protocols. He swore loudly that the massive funds would absolutely clear, but it would take at least 90 business days for the international wire transfers to fully process through the proper legal channels. The incredibly weak, pathetic lie hung heavily in the cold morning air. It was a spectacularly flimsy excuse, completely devoid of the sharp, confident polish he usually employed. Richard stared intently at Jamal's sweating, terrified face, and the massive, impenetrable wall of absolute delusion suddenly completely shattered. The heavy gears in Richard's mind finally slammed into place, grinding violently against the harsh, unforgiving reality. He remembered the specific dates of the aggressive second mortgage withdrawals. He remembered the massive wire transfers he had personally authorized directly into Jamal's startup accounts. He remembered the incredibly lavish spending, the expensive designer suits, the custom luxury vehicles, and the aggressive demolition of my old bedroom just to build a massive sneaker closet. The terrifying math finally added up perfectly in his mind. There was no revolutionary predictive machine learning algorithm. There was no elite board of wealthy Silicon Valley investors. There was absolutely no massive million-dollar seed round. The entire technology startup was a spectacular, highly orchestrated fraud, and he had personally funded the entire scam using the equity of the very house they were now being violently evicted from. The horrifying realization hit Richard with the devastating force of a speeding freight train. He had completely destroyed his own financial life to aggressively finance a cheap con artist. A raw, violent surge of pure adrenaline and absolute blind rage violently overtook him. Richard unleashed a deafening, ferocious roar and forcefully shoved Jamal aggressively backward. The younger man slammed violently against the heavy wooden banister, stumbling awkwardly over his expensive silk slippers. Jamal frantically tried to apologize, his voice raising in high-pitched absolute panic, but Richard was completely, entirely unhinged. The wealthy, sophisticated patriarch completely vanished instantly, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal, aggressively fighting for its exact survival. Richard lunged forward violently, grabbing the thick collar of Jamal's silk dressing gown and forcefully twisting the expensive fabric until Jamal began choking. He aggressively slammed Jamal's back against the hallway wall, rattling the expensive framed family portraits hanging carefully along the corridor. Richard aggressively screamed directly into Jamal's face, demanding to know exactly where his money was, furiously demanding the immediate return of the hundreds of thousands of dollars he had foolishly handed over. The violent physical altercation immediately sent massive shockwaves of pure chaos throughout the entire upper floor of the estate. Brittany, who had been standing frozen in total shock near the doorway of her custom designer nursery, finally snapped. The sheer terrifying reality of her husband being violently assaulted by her furious father completely broke her fragile mental state. She let out a piercing, hysterical shriek, completely dropping to her knees on the expensive plush hallway carpet. She clutched her pregnant stomach, aggressively sobbing violently and uncontrollably. Her shrill voice pierced the chaotic, violent air, aggressively screaming that the intense, overwhelming stress was actively harming her baby. She frantically begged them to stop fighting completely, ignoring the terrifying reality that they were all about to be completely permanently homeless in less than 3 days. She aggressively wailed about her ruined nursery, her destroyed social standing, and her deeply fractured perfect life. Her loud, dramatic, hysterical crying actively fueled the absolute madness violently swirling in the hallway. Down in the massive grand entryway, Patricia remained entirely frozen on the floor, utterly paralyzed by the violent screaming echoing loudly from the second-floor landing. The beautiful, expensive custom coffee mug was completely destroyed, the dark liquid ruined the imported floorboards, and the bright neon red eviction notice was crushed tightly in her shaking hand. The absolute perfect, wealthy suburban illusion they had violently protected at all costs had finally violently detonated from the inside out. They were violently tearing each other apart precisely as I knew they would. I watched the entire horrific, chaotic collapse unfold perfectly in high definition through the secure digital feeds sitting quietly in my warm, calm penthouse office. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or guilt. I simply watched the spectacular, violent destruction of their fragile kingdom, entirely satisfied that my meticulously constructed financial trap was actively functioning with absolute devastating perfection. The 72-hour countdown was relentlessly, aggressively ticking away, and their total absolute ruin was now completely, entirely inescapable. The chaotic, violent energy that had aggressively consumed the second-floor hallway eventually burned itself out, leaving behind a suffocating, toxic silence. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the massive Winnetka estate felt like an abandoned, haunted mausoleum. Through my secure digital surveillance feeds, I watched the fragmented pieces of my deeply fractured family retreat into their own isolated corners of absolute despair. Richard had locked himself securely inside his dark mahogany study, aggressively consuming whatever remaining alcohol he could find, until he finally passed out heavily across his expensive leather desk. Patricia had taken a massive dose of prescription sedatives and was completely unconscious in the master bedroom, completely dead to the freezing world outside. Brittany had finally stopped her loud, hysterical wailing and was currently curled into a tight fetal position on the floor of her half-finished custom nursery, softly sobbing herself to sleep, surrounded by imported plush toys she could no longer afford. The only person actively moving through the dark, freezing house was Jamal. His survival instincts were operating at absolute maximum capacity. The physical altercation with my father had completely shattered the delicate, profitable illusion he had carefully maintained for months. Jamal knew with absolute concrete certainty that the lucrative long con was officially permanently over. There was no more home equity to steal. There were no more wealthy elderly investors to smoothly manipulate at country club parties. Richard finally knew the devastating truth about the fake technology startup and the missing funds. It was only a matter of hours before my father woke up from his drunken stupor and immediately contacted the local police to file massive federal fraud charges. Furthermore, the bright neon red eviction notice firmly taped to the front door meant the county sheriff was actively coming to physically clear the massive property in less than 60 hours. Jamal was a slick, confident parasite But he was ultimately a massive coward who entirely lacked the backbone required to face severe legal consequences or physical confrontation. He was not going to stand bravely beside his pregnant wife and weather the terrifying suburban storm. He was going to aggressively cut his massive losses and run for his life. Through the high-definition night vision camera mounted discreetly in the upstairs hallway, I watched his frantic, cowardly escape plan unfold in real time. He crept silently out of the guest bedroom where he had been aggressively banished after the violent hallway fight. He was moving with frantic, nervous energy, his head darting back and forth, checking the dark shadows. He did not go to the ruined nursery to wake his sleeping pregnant wife. He did not leave a remorseful apology note on the kitchen counter. His first deliberate stop was the dark, quiet master suite. He knew exactly where Patricia carelessly kept her personal, unprotected digital devices. He silently slipped through the cracked wooden door and retrieved her primary tablet from the expensive nightstand, completely ignoring the heavy breathing of his heavily sedated mother-in-law. He carried the illuminated tablet into the massive custom walk-in closet, the very same space they had violently destroyed my childhood bedroom to create. Sitting on the floor surrounded by his expensive stolen luxury goods, Jamal quickly bypassed Patricia's incredibly weak digital security password. It was a password I had warned her about years ago, but she had arrogantly claimed she had nothing to hide. I watched his glowing face on the camera feed as he quickly accessed her primary personal checking account. It was the only account that had not been heavily leveraged against the defaulted second mortgage. It held roughly $12,000 intended for emergency household expenses and the upcoming monthly country club dues. Without a single ounce of hesitation, Jamal rapidly executed a series of untraceable digital transfers, aggressively draining every single remaining penny directly into his own hidden prepaid debit accounts. He was stealing the absolute last financial lifeline from the very people who had arrogantly crowned him a brilliant king. It was a spectacular final act of pure, unadulterated betrayal. Once the digital theft was fully complete, Jamal tossed the useless tablet onto the pile of drywall dust and grabbed two massive, expensive leather duffel bags. He did not pack any basic necessities or sentimental family items. He operated with cold, calculating greed, strictly grabbing anything with high, immediate pawn value. I watched him frantically stuff his custom-tailored Italian designer suits, imported silk shirts, and multiple heavy gold watches into the bags. He carefully boxed up the highly expensive limited edition luxury sneakers he had just built the custom shrine to, ensuring they were perfectly protected for his cowardly getaway. He zipped the heavy leather bags closed, completely abandoning the vast majority of his personal belongings just to ensure he could move fast. He walked right past the ruined nursery without casting a single backward glance, completely turning his back on the woman carrying his unborn child. He was leaving her to wake up completely alone, entirely broke and legally mandated to be violently thrown out into the freezing snow by the county sheriff. He navigated the dark, silent staircase, avoiding the specific wooden steps he knew would aggressively creak in the quiet night. He slipped quietly through the heavy mudroom door and entered the massive attached garage. The bitter winter chill instantly hit him, but he did not slow down. He quickly approached his pristine black luxury Mercedes sedan. It was a top-tier premium vehicle completely leased using my father's stolen equity strictly to project the aggressive image of a highly successful chief executive officer. Jamal carefully loaded his heavy stolen designer bags into the spacious trunk, quietly closing the heavy lid to avoid echoing throughout the dark garage. He slipped into the heated leather driver's seat and gently pushed the quiet ignition button. The expensive German engine purred softly to life, barely making a sound. He pressed the remote control button mounted on the sun visor, and the massive garage door slowly began to rise, letting the brutal, screaming winter wind and heavy driving snow violently into the space. Jamal did not wait for the heavy door to fully open. He aggressively slammed his foot onto the gas pedal, heavily spinning the premium tires on the smooth concrete floor. The black Mercedes shot backward out into the raging blizzard, fishtailing slightly on the icy cobblestone driveway before he sharply, violently corrected the steering. He did not pause at the end of the long, dark driveway to look back at the massive estate he had successfully helped entirely destroy. He aggressively turned the wheel and accelerated rapidly down the dark, freezing suburban street, entirely disappearing into the thick, blinding white snow. I sat quietly in my warm penthouse watching the taillights fade away on the exterior digital feed. The brilliant visionary son-in-law, the absolute pride of the entire family, had officially fled the state like a terrified rat, abandoning a sinking ship, leaving his ruined in-laws and his pregnant wife entirely alone to face the absolute devastating consequences of their own massive, blinding arrogance. The freezing sun finally breached the dark horizon, casting long, harsh shadows across the snow-covered city of Chicago. Inside the Winnetka estate, the brutal reality of the morning was actively setting in. I watched the digital monitors as Patricia finally began to stir in the master bedroom. The heavy dose of prescription sedatives wore off, leaving her groggy and disoriented. She reached blindly for her tablet on the nightstand, entirely unaware that her precious son-in-law had completely drained her final financial safety net while she slept. When she finally managed to focus her blurry eyes on the banking application, the immediate shock jolted her completely awake. The screen clearly displayed a devastating zero balance. She frantically tore through the massive house, her heavy silk robe trailing behind her, screaming for Jamal. She found the ruined custom walk-in closet completely stripped of its expensive designer contents. She found the heavy leather duffel bags missing. She found the garage completely empty, where the leased black Mercedes used to be parked. The horrifying truth was staring her directly in the face, but Patricia possessed a truly supernatural ability to forcefully reject reality. Instead of collapsing into a puddle of despair or immediately calling the police to report a massive theft, she actively chose to construct a brand new, highly elaborate delusion. I watched her forcefully march into the kitchen, where Richard was slumped miserably over a cold cup of coffee. She aggressively slapped her hands on the marble counter and loudly declared that Jamal had simply been called away on an emergency international business trip to secure the final legal paperwork for his massive seed funding round. She forcefully insisted that the missing money from her checking account was clearly just a temporary strategic transfer to cover sudden international escrow fees. She completely refused to acknowledge the violent fight that had occurred the night before. She completely ignored the bright neon red eviction notice currently sitting crumpled in the garbage can. In her deeply fractured mind, they were not broke, and they were certainly not being evicted. They were just experiencing a minor temporary inconvenience caused by a silly banking error. But even a profound delusion requires basic shelter from the freezing winter storm raging outside. Sitting in my warm penthouse office, my secure private cell phone suddenly buzzed violently against the glass desktop. The caller identification displayed my mother's private cell phone number. I had not spoken directly to her since the bizarre confrontation in the catering kitchen during the lavish weekend party. A small part of me honestly believed she was calling to finally apologize. A tiny foolish fragment of my former self thought that the absolute total collapse of her wealthy kingdom and the sudden cowardly abandonment by her favorite son-in-law might have finally shattered her toxic arrogance. I thought perhaps the freezing reality of imminent homelessness had finally humbled her enough to beg for genuine forgiveness. I reached out and slowly picked up the device. I pressed the green accept button and lifted the speaker to my ear, remaining entirely silent. I did not offer a polite greeting. I simply waited to see exactly which version of my mother was on the other end of the line. The voice that aggressively blasted through the tiny speaker was utterly devoid of any humility or remorse. It was frantic and heavily strained, but it absolutely dripped with the exact same toxic entitlement she had wielded against me my entire life. "Clara," she barked sharply, her voice echoing with harsh, commanding authority. She did not ask how I was doing. She immediately launched into her aggressive, fabricated narrative. She loudly announced that Jamal had to leave on a sudden business trip to manage his massive corporate investments. She aggressively framed the entire catastrophic situation as a minor logistical annoyance, She casually stated that there is a misunderstanding with the bank regarding the mortgage and that they simply needed to temporarily vacate the property while Richard's lawyers sorted the entire mess out. She spoke incredibly fast, completely refusing to allow me a single second to respond or question the absolute massive holes in her ridiculous story. Then came the ultimate breathtaking demand. She did not request a small favor. She issued a direct military order. She forcefully ordered me to immediately drive to my local bank and completely empty my entire personal savings account. "You need to empty your savings right now and rent a luxury apartment for us," she demanded aggressively. She sharply complained that it is freezing outside and completely unacceptable for a woman of her high social standing to be uncomfortable. She commanded that I secure a massive 3-bedroom unit with a premium view and a dedicated concierge service specifically to accommodate Brittany's extreme pregnancy stress. She forcefully added that I needed to hurry up and have the keys physically delivered to the Winnetka estate before sunset, because they absolutely refused to pack their belongings in the dark. She was demanding I permanently bankrupt myself to completely finance her fake wealthy lifestyle, while actively lying to my face about the very scam artist who had just robbed her blind. The sheer absolute magnitude of her unwavering audacity was honestly entirely majestic. It was a perfect, flawless masterpiece of complete narcissistic delusion. I sat perfectly still in my expensive leather chair, letting her frantic, aggressive demands echo loudly in my silent office. I looked at the massive digital monitors displaying the live security feeds of the dark, freezing house. I saw the absolute ruin they had brought entirely upon themselves through their own vicious greed. I thought about the freezing rain hitting my face when they locked me out. I thought about the sledgehammer destroying my childhood sanctuary. I thought about the bright red notice legally enforcing their total destruction. My mother briefly paused her aggressive rant to take a quick, sharp breath, expecting me to immediately submit and obey her toxic commands. I did not argue with her. I did not point out the missing Mercedes or the drained bank accounts. I did not inform her that my blind corporate entity was the exact reason she was being aggressively thrown into the snow. I simply moved the phone away from my ear, pressed the red button, and hung up the phone without saying a single solitary word. The dead silence on the line after I ended the call felt heavier than the brutal winter storm raging against my penthouse windows. I placed the phone face down on my glass desk and turned my full, undivided attention back to the massive array of digital security monitors. The next 48 hours dragged by in a state of absolute suspended animation inside the Winnetka estate. My family remained completely trapped inside their massive freezing house, paralyzed by a potent mixture of stubborn denial and absolute financial terror. They did not pack a single box. They did not hire a moving truck. They simply huddled together in the dark living room, entirely convinced that their wealthy social status would somehow magically shield them from the heavy, crushing weight of the law. They waited for a miraculous rescue that was never going to arrive. Thursday morning finally broke over the Chicago coastline, bringing with it a massive secondary wave of the brutal winter blizzard. The temperature plummeted to single digits, and thick, blinding sheets of white snow violently hammered the manicured suburban streets. Exactly at 8 o'clock in the morning, the absolute final second of the 72-hour legal grace period officially expired. My blind corporate entity, Echo Holdings, LLC, was now legally authorized to completely seize the physical property. I leaned forward in my expensive leather chair, my eyes locked entirely onto the high-definition exterior camera feed. Through the heavy driving snow, a massive convoy of heavy-duty vehicles slowly turned onto my parents' long cobblestone driveway. It was not a polite legal representative or a flexible bank manager. It was a heavy tactical display of absolute county authority. Two massive black and white county sheriff sport utility vehicles led the procession, their bright blue and red emergency lights cutting sharply through the thick white blizzard. They were immediately followed by 3 massive commercial moving trucks and a highly synchronized team of heavy property preservation contractors. The sheer scale of the foreclosure operation was breathtaking. 4 heavily armed county deputies stepped out into the freezing slush wearing thick tactical winter gear. They marched aggressively up the front stone steps, completely ignoring the bitter howling wind. The lead sheriff did not bother ringing the expensive brass doorbell. He aggressively pounded his heavy flashlight against the custom mahogany front door, demanding immediate entry under the strict authority of the county court. Inside the house, the sudden violent banging echoed like a massive cannon shot. Through the interior hallway camera, I watched Richard completely freeze his face, draining of all color. He frantically tried to lock the heavy deadbolts, but he was far too late. A certified county locksmith stepped forward and rapidly drilled straight through the expensive custom locking mechanisms. The heavy mahogany doors were forcefully shoved open, letting the brutal, screaming winter wind and a small army of strangers violently into the grand entryway. The chaotic breach of their sacred wealthy sanctuary was absolute and instantaneous. The heavy tactical boots of the armed deputies aggressively tracked thick, freezing slush directly across the imported pristine hardwood floorboards. The lead sheriff loudly announced that the property was now officially under the legal possession of Echo Holdings LLC and demanded that all previous occupants immediately vacate the premises. Richard violently snapped out of his shocked paralysis and aggressively charged at the armed officers. He was wearing his ridiculous velvet smoking jacket, completely unwashed and reeking of stale imported scotch. He aggressively thrust his finger directly into the chest of the lead sheriff, screaming violently at the top of his lungs. He loudly threatened to file massive federal lawsuits against the entire county department. He aggressively name-dropped the local mayor and several wealthy conservative politicians, demanding the officers immediately leave his private property. The seasoned sheriff did not even blink. He was an absolute brick wall of legal authority. He coldly informed Richard that he was currently trespassing on private corporate property and forcefully warned him that any further physical resistance would result in an immediate brutal arrest for felony assault. Patricia frantically ran down the grand sweeping staircase, wearing the exact same heavy silk bathrobe she had been wearing for 3 days. She violently grabbed the sheriff's thick winter jacket, hysterically crying and aggressively begging for just one more week to contact their non-existent lawyers. The deputies possessed absolutely zero emotional bandwidth for wealthy suburban tears. Following strict protocol, they physically separated my aggressive parents and began forcefully marching them directly toward the open front door. Brittany stumbled blindly out of the ruined custom nursery, completely hysterical. She was wearing thin cotton pajamas and aggressively clutching her pregnant stomach. She was loudly wailing about her missing husband and her ruined perfect life. The deputies grabbed her gently by the arms and firmly escorted her down the stairs. Within less than 5 minutes, my entire arrogant family was forcefully physically shoved out of their warm, massive house and entirely abandoned on the freezing, snow-covered front lawn. The massive, heavy steel doors of the commercial moving trucks aggressively rolled open, and the massive property preservation team immediately swarmed the estate. They were not gentle, and they did not care about designer labels. They operated with ruthless mechanical efficiency, strictly following the legal mandate to completely clear the premises. I watched in absolute silent satisfaction as the massive moving crew began hauling out the physical manifestations of my family's fake wealth. They aggressively dragged the heavy velvet antique sofas directly out the front door, dumping them carelessly onto the freezing icy driveway. They violently dismantled the expensive custom crystal chandeliers, packing them into cheap cardboard boxes. I watched 2 burly movers carelessly carry out the massive unboxed limited edition luxury baby crib that Brittany had arrogantly purchased with my father's stolen equity. They threw it aggressively into the back of the massive truck, completely scratching the expensive white paint. Standing barefoot in the freezing deep snow, Richard violently completely lost his mind. He aggressively lunged at the massive moving crew, frantically trying to physically rip his expensive crystal decanters out of their heavy gloved hands. Two armed deputies immediately intercepted him, violently slamming him face first against the icy hood of the county patrol vehicle and aggressively securing his wrists with heavy steel handcuffs. Patricia completely collapsed onto the freezing snow-covered lawn, entirely unable to process the absolute violent destruction of her wealthy social empire. She just sat in the freezing slush, shivering violently in her silk robe, completely broken. Brittany was on her knees, aggressively sobbing into her frozen hands, frantically screaming Jamal's name into the howling winter wind. They were completely, entirely ruined. The massive, wealthy castle they had violently protected by throwing me out into the freezing rain was officially permanently gone. I sat quietly in my warm, safe penthouse, watching their absolute, complete destruction unfold on the glowing monitors, a cold, hard smile permanently fixed on my face. The debt was officially fully collected. The freezing wind howled violently across the manicured lawns, tearing through the bare branches of the ancient oak trees. The chaotic symphony of the massive property preservation team tearing apart the grand estate was suddenly interrupted by the low, powerful hum of a heavy engine. A sleek, heavily armored black sport utility vehicle smoothly cut through the thick driving blizzard, slowly turning onto the icy cobblestone driveway. It was an intimidating, massive machine, completely blacked out, and heavily customized, radiating absolute power and total control. It rolled to a smooth stop directly behind the massive county sheriff vehicles, perfectly blocking any potential exit route. The heavy tinted windows obscured the interior, completely hiding my identity from the frozen, desperate people currently being violently processed on the front lawn. The heavy armored passenger door swung open with a solid mechanical thud, and I stepped out directly into the brutal, freezing storm. I was not the terrified, desperate daughter they had violently thrown out into the freezing rain all those years ago. I was dressed flawlessly in an expensive, custom-tailored cashmere winter coat, heavy, dark leather gloves, and premium designer boots that aggressively crunched against the freezing, icy slush. Two high-level corporate attorneys immediately stepped out of the heavy vehicle, flanking me perfectly on either side. They wore sharp, expensive dark suits underneath their heavy wool overcoats, gripping thick leather briefcases containing the absolute flawless legal documentation of my total victory. We walked smoothly and deliberately up the long, icy driveway, moving in perfect synchronization. The armed county deputies immediately recognized my top-tier corporate legal team and respectfully stepped aside, parting the chaotic sea of heavy movers and aggressive contractors to grant me clear, undeniable passage to my legally acquired property. The violent commotion on the freezing lawn suddenly completely stopped. Patricia looked up from the freezing slush, her heavily sedated eyes blinking frantically in absolute total disbelief. Brittany temporarily ceased her loud, hysterical wailing, staring blankly at my expensive tailored clothing and the aggressive, powerful stance of my expensive legal team. But Richard reacted with pure, unadulterated venom. He was still aggressively pinned against the icy hood of the county patrol vehicle, his wrists locked tightly in heavy steel handcuffs. His face was completely purple from the freezing cold and his own massive, violent rage. When his bloodshot eyes locked onto my face, his entire body violently convulsed against the heavy metal of the police car. The absolute audacity of my arrival entirely shattered his remaining fragile composure. "Did you come to gloat?" He violently spat, his hoarse voice aggressively cutting through the howling winter wind. He violently strained against the heavy metal cuffs, completely ignoring the armed deputy standing directly next to him. His absolute blind arrogance was truly staggering to witness in person. Even completely ruined, freezing in the snow and facing severe felony assault charges, he fundamentally believed he was still the supreme commander of the family. He aggressively thrust his chin forward, his eyes burning with intense, toxic hatred. "Tell your lawyer to figure out who owns this Echo Holdings company so I can sue them into the ground." He aggressively screamed, violently kicking the icy tires of the patrol car. He loudly demanded that I instantly deploy my legal resources to track down the massive, faceless corporate entity that had forcefully stolen his precious kingdom, completely oblivious to the massive, devastating reality standing right in front of him. I stopped precisely 4 feet away from him, allowing the brutal, freezing wind to whip my dark hair around my face. I did not flinch at his violent, aggressive screaming. I did not offer a single ounce of pity for his freezing, pathetic condition. I stared directly into his bloodshot, furious eyes with absolute cold, calculating precision. I remained perfectly silent for several long, agonizing seconds, letting his frantic, violent screams echo loudly off the massive stone walls of the estate he no longer owned. The lead attorney, standing directly to my right, slowly unclasped his expensive leather briefcase. He smoothly extracted a thick stack of highly official legal documents featuring heavily embossed corporate seals and bright red mandatory county foreclosure stamps. He calmly stepped forward and held the massive legal file directly in front of Richard's freezing red face. I did not need to hire a lawyer to find the owner of Echo Holdings. I stated, my voice completely flat and entirely devoid of any human emotion. The words cut through the freezing winter air with the absolute devastating precision of a surgical scalpel. I kept my cold, dead eyes firmly locked entirely onto his. I registered the exact corporate entity anonymously through a highly secure blind trust, the exact same day you violently threw me out of this house to finance a common street thief. I smoothly gestured to the heavy stack of legal documents currently resting against the frozen hood of the police car. Echo Holdings is entirely, completely me. I own the absolute massive toxic debt you foolishly acquired. I personally triggered the mandatory aggressive foreclosure protocol. I am the sole exclusive legal owner of this massive estate, and every single piece of expensive garbage currently being dragged out of it. The devastating, brutal truth slammed into Richard with the massive physical force of a concrete wall. The violent, aggressive rage instantly permanently drained from his freezing purple face, replaced by a sudden, horrifying look of absolute total comprehension. He stopped straining against the heavy steel handcuffs. His knees violently buckled against the icy metal bumper of the police car, and he slumped downward, completely defeated. He looked desperately toward Patricia, who had just violently vomited into the freezing snow upon hearing the absolute massive revelation. Brittany was completely frozen in absolute sheer terror, clutching her stomach as the horrifying reality of my total engineered revenge entirely washed over her. I had not just legally taken their expensive house. I had meticulously orchestrated their complete, absolute financial and social annihilation using the exact same ruthless corporate tactics my father had worshipped his entire pathetic life. I stood perfectly still in the driving blizzard, watching the massive, crushing weight of their own destructive arrogance finally bury them alive. The lead county sheriff slowly stepped forward, completely breaking the heavy, suffocating silence that had descended upon the freezing front lawn. He casually brushed a thick layer of accumulating snow from the dark fabric of his heavy tactical uniform and respectfully tipped his wide-brimmed hat directly toward me. "Good morning, Ms. Williams," he stated, his deep, authoritative voice projecting clearly over the violent, howling wind. "The property has been fully secured for Echo Holdings. The moving crews are currently finalizing the absolute extraction of all remaining personal property, and the high-security perimeter locks have been completely successfully changed. We are prepared to officially hand over full operational control of the estate directly to your legal team immediately." That single, respectful, professional interaction entirely sealed their fate. The armed deputies who had just violently slammed my father against the icy hood of a patrol car were actively treating me with the absolute highest level of professional deference. I was no longer the discarded, useless daughter. I was the incredibly wealthy, powerful client. The last remaining microscopic fragments of color completely drained from the faces of the 3 freezing, pathetic figures huddled in the snow. The horrific, devastating reality of my absolute total victory violently washed over them in massive, crushing waves. Patricia remained collapsed in the freezing slush, shivering violently uncontrollably in her ruined silk bathrobe. Her eyes were completely wide and vacant, staring blankly at the massive tactical vehicles that had entirely destroyed her fragile, perfect suburban illusion. The arrogant sneer she had worn her entire life was permanently, completely erased. Brittany was completely paralyzed with absolute sheer terror. The devastating combination of her missing fraudulent husband and the sudden terrifying realization that her despised older sister was the exact anonymous billionaire who had just violently orchestrated her total destruction completely broke her fragile mind. She just sat in the freezing snow, clutching her pregnant stomach, rocking back and forth in absolute complete silence. Richard was entirely, completely broken. The violent, aggressive patriarch who had aggressively ruled this massive estate with an iron fist for decades was now just a freezing, pathetic old man, securely handcuffed to a police vehicle. His massive chest heaved heavily, struggling violently to pull the freezing winter air into his collapsing lungs. I smoothly stepped forward, my expensive leather boots aggressively crunching the thick, icy slush. I walked directly into his personal space, completely ignoring the armed deputy standing mere inches away. I slowly reached into the deep inner pocket of my heavy cashmere winter coat and gracefully extracted a thick, perfectly folded legal document. It was the official recorded deed to the Winnetka estate, featuring the bright red mandatory county foreclosure stamps and the absolute final authorized signature of the county judge. I held the crisp, heavy paper perfectly steady in my gloved hand, allowing Richard to clearly read the bold black ink explicitly listing Echo Holdings, LLC, as the absolute sole legitimate owner of the massive property. Then I simply opened my fingers. The heavy legal document fluttered softly through the freezing, howling wind and landed perfectly in the dark gray freezing slush directly at his ruined feet. I stared directly into his shattered, defeated eyes with absolute, total, icy clarity. The moment I had meticulously planned for years had finally completely arrived. "You were right, Dad," I stated, my voice completely flat and entirely devoid of any human emotion. "There wasn't enough space in this house for me, so I bought it." I watched the devastating words violently strike him physically, forcing his head to sag heavily against his chest. I did not raise my voice. I did not aggressively scream or violently gloat. I simply delivered the absolute crushing reality of his total failure. "It is going to be completely demolished next week," I continued, gesturing smoothly toward the massive ancient stone walls of the grand estate. "The massive bulldozers are already fully contracted. The entire grand structure, your custom mahogany study, the ruined nursery, your pristine custom walk-in closets, all of it will be violently leveled into dirt. I am actively clearing the entire massive lot to build a high-capacity data storage server farm for my $80 million cybersecurity company." The massive financial figure hung heavily in the freezing, violent air, completely suffocating them. $80 million, a highly verified, fully legitimate, massive corporate valuation. Richard violently squeezed his eyes shut as the devastating, horrific irony finally completely crushed his soul. He had aggressively thrown me out into the freezing rain and entirely destroyed his own financial life to blindly finance a cheap con artist who stole a few $100,000. Meanwhile, the daughter he had violently discarded had quietly, meticulously built a massive, legitimate empire entirely without his money or his toxic approval. His blinding arrogance had actively prevented him from recognizing the absolute massive wealth and immense power standing directly in front of him. I possessed the absolute brutal financial capacity to buy his entire fake kingdom with cash and violently crush it into dust simply because I wanted the empty land. I looked down at his freezing, pathetic, shivering form and delivered the absolute final devastating blow. "Now go live in the streets." I did not wait for a desperate apology or a violent, frantic response. I gracefully turned my back on the entire ruined family, completely erasing them from my existence. I signaled sharply to my expensive legal team and walked smoothly back toward the massive, heavy armored sport utility vehicle. Behind me, the massive commercial moving trucks forcefully slammed their heavy metal doors, completely sealing away the last pathetic remnants of my family's fake wealth. The heavy tactical engines roared powerfully to life, preparing to aggressively roll out into the freezing, blinding blizzard. I smoothly climbed into the warm, luxurious leather interior of the armored vehicle, completely shutting the heavy bulletproof door. I did not look out the heavily tinted window as my driver smoothly accelerated away from the massive estate, leaving my ruined, broken family completely alone, freezing in the deep winter snow precisely as I had promised. The heavy armored sport utility vehicle began to smoothly inch forward through the thick, accumulating snow. The massive tires gripped the icy cobblestone driveway, preparing to completely exit the ruined estate forever. Suddenly, a pathetic, fragile figure threw herself directly into the exact path of the massive, heavy machine. My highly trained driver instantly slammed his heavy boot onto the premium brakes, causing the massive vehicle to sharply skid across the freezing gray slush. I reached forward and firmly pressed the heavy steel button on the polished door panel. The thick, bulletproof glass slowly rolled down, letting the brutal, screaming winter wind immediately whip violently through the heated luxury cabin. Patricia was entirely on her hands and knees in the freezing, dirty slush, actively clawing at the expensive custom tires. She forcefully dragged her shivering, ruined body toward my open window, completely ignoring the two armed county deputies rushing rapidly forward to physically remove her from the private driveway. She collapsed heavily, directly beneath my open window, actively sobbing uncontrollably into the freezing winter air. The absolute toxic arrogance that had entirely defined her privileged existence was completely, permanently eradicated. She frantically begged for genuine forgiveness, her shrill voice violently cracking under the immense crushing weight of her total physical and social destruction. She wildly promised to completely change her toxic behavior, frantically offering to work as my personal domestic servant if I would just simply allow them to sleep inside the massive empty house for one single freezing night. She loudly cried that she was entirely too old to be homeless, actively pleading with me to remember that she was my mother. Behind her fragile, freezing form, Brittany remained entirely collapsed on the ruined, snowy front lawn. The horrifying reality of her missing fraudulent husband and her permanently destroyed social status had finally completely shattered her fragile mind. She violently slammed her bare, freezing hands against the icy ground, aggressively wailing Jamal's name into the unforgiving, roaring winter storm. Her loud, hysterical cries were completely ignored by the massive property preservation team, who were actively continuing to aggressively haul her expensive stolen furniture out into the freezing driveway. They ruthlessly dumped her custom-imported baby clothes directly into heavy, black trash bags, entirely indifferent to her massive public breakdown. Richard did not move a single rigid muscle. He remained securely, heavily handcuffed to the icy hood of the massive county patrol vehicle, completely, entirely broken. His bloodshot eyes stared blankly at the massive, heavy tires of my armored vehicle, entirely unable to process the absolute devastating reality that his legally discarded daughter was actively leaving him to physically freeze in the brutal city streets. The massive, wealthy empire he had violently built on a dark foundation of toxic lies, aggressive financial manipulation, and profound family betrayal was entirely reduced to freezing, worthless ash. He had aggressively traded his own flesh and blood for a cheap, hollow illusion, and now the brutal universe was actively collecting the ultimate, permanent toll.